A couple of scriptures from the Hebrew Bible. The first one is from Joshua. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. And these words from the book of Jeremiah. I, the Lord, command you to do what is just and right. Protect the person who is being cheated from the one who is cheating him. Do not ill-treat or oppress foreigners, orphans, or widows, and do not kill innocent people in this holy place. I've been having this inner debate over the last few days about whether I need to kind of justify or kind of apologize for what I plan to do in this sermon. It's not an apology exactly, but I'm not sure whether this will end up being more of a sermon or a book report. And the reason I think it is quite justifiable to do this is because this information that I think is so important to share is so closely comes at the nexus of two justice issues that this congregation has been looking at and has been committed to for a long time. One of those is racism, and the other is housing. And so this morning, I preached not only for myself, but on behalf of the diversity team, which has been looking at the book called The Color of Law for a while now. I first heard Richard Rothstein, who is over at UC Berkeley. He works in the Economic Policy Institute, talk about these ideas about, well, let me tell you what the subtitle of this book is: The Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. I mean, that kind of says it right there. That's what he does in the course of this book. He shows how segregation is not the process of a bunch of individual decisions or individual preferences, but in fact, a whole series of laws and statutes and ordinances at the national level, the state level, and the local level that have created segregating housing in the United States of America. I first heard Richard speak on one KQED show or another, and I'm often driving when I'm listening to KQED, and you know how, I think I've kind of confessed to you before that I have a lot of kind of drive-by information, stuff that you know comes as I'm listening to various radio shows, which I'm kind of addicted to, I have to say. That's the other confession. But I was immediately struck by what he was talking about, and this, I think, was actually before he wrote this book. And I was kind of shocked and captivated by this idea and this case that he makes systematically about the evidence that shows that, in fact, segregation, especially in housing, has happened a lot because of government policy. Not by individual choice, but government policy. And that just, it kind of stuck with me, and I remember talking to a couple of people about it at church, other people who had happened to have heard the same show on the radio. And then a couple of years later, Richard kind of reappeared. I think it must have been just as he was publishing this book. So he had taken some of this research that he had done, that he had first started to report on, and he had created this book called The Color of Law. And he was showing up again on various media outlets. We started talking about the book in the diversity team, and we read it together, we talked about it, and actually have been looking at it for the last couple of years. It's actually been quite a while. We tried various numbers of ways to see if we could get him to come and speak at the church. It just didn't quite work out. But we decided that it was so important for larger groups of people to have access to this information because it is so fundamental, it feels to me, in terms of understanding how racism might be working in our country and the ways that we might have been misled about the truth of that. And because these are such important justice issues and also kind of explain a number of things that are happening in the current world, it seems to me to pay a little bit of attention to this morning. And not just this morning, but beyond as well. We're going to be doing 2 learning hours both today and next week on this. We have some resources on the website. And our purpose is to get this knowing into as many bodies as we can in this community. If we have that shared information and hopefully shared belief, then that might help to create the groundswell from which other things might come. And I have to say right now that neither Rothstein nor I are going to suggest remedies for this. He didn't take that on as his task. He's primarily a historian. He thought his job, and he says this very clearly, he thinks the first step is to understand this history that is not shared, not taught, that's the first step for us to understand this history. So that's what I'm going to be talking about this morning. I think this book ranks right up with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, that if you were going to read a couple of books about the way that racism works in the United States, I would recommend those 2 books. That's how important I think it is. If you're not ready to read the whole thing, we've created a 2-page summary of it that you can look through. As I've said, our goal is to get this information in as many bodies as possible. So one of the thoughts that are kind of common understandings that's been true in the big picture in the United States and also in the courts of law is the difference between de facto and de jure segregation. And we've got these 2 phrases up on the screen. How many of you are just familiar with these terms, have heard them? So the common thought is that a lot of segregation has happened as de facto segregation, that is, as actually the result of a group of individual decisions or choices that the people who are buying and selling houses have made, that it's really just about this thing that happens in our capitalist system as we're dealing with properties and real estate, but that it's not really, that it is a result of those things, as opposed to the intent of those things. And Rothstein systematically dismantles this idea, that he actually makes the strongest case that I've ever heard, that actually what we have is de jure segregation, which means that it's by law or by statute, that it's actually the action of governments, as I said before, at all levels, national, state, and local. And let me just give you 2 or 3 examples of how that's the case. His evidence is so compelling, that's the reason that I would recommend the book. It's just like case after case after case. And he actually starts, I think in one of the earliest chapters, he starts with Richmond, California. So this is not just something that was happening in the South. He maintains that it's actually happening in basically every urban center in the United States. Every urban center in the United States. So one of the things that happened, and again, this history, there's quite a bit of history to this, but a lot of it happens around World War II and following World War II, because there was such a need both during the war and after the war for housing. This is when public housing first started getting developed. And actually, public housing was first developed for white people. Public housing was being developed because there needed to be more workers near the factories where they were making materials for the war. But early on, the development of public housing became segregated, that housing was created for white communities and housing was created for people of color. And of course, as we talk about people of color, mostly in the United States, this history has to do with the plight of African Americans. So in a place like Richmond, there were certain areas where housing was created for white people, and then there are other areas which were less desirable that were created for people of color, mostly African Americans. A similar sort of thing actually happened around Palo Alto. So we now know, we talk about Palo Alto and we talk about East Palo Alto, and we know that East Palo Alto is predominantly people of color. And one of the reasons for that was because of these restrictions around public housing, and later on restrictions on where anyone could buy a house. Now some of this segregation and separation also happened actually at the highest level of the government, in the Federal Housing Administration, when that was created, which I think was part of the New Deal. And it was written into the guidelines, the lending guidelines, that developments, these new developments that were being created, very large subdivisions with lots of houses in them, and it was actually written into the guidelines that they could only be sold to white people. So there were developers who were being subsidized by the government to create these large tracts of housing, and they were restricting who could live in them. So this is not individual choice. It was by law and by statute. Later on, as people had to kind of work around some of the laws, there were other strategies that were used to create this separation. So for example, with zoning laws. And some of the trends in zoning, which you might think, well, each individual city is creating their own zoning laws. These are all happening separately in a lot of different places. But actually, as zoning laws were starting to be created, they were started at the federal level. Guidelines from the federal level about how areas might be zoned. And it was often true that the areas where people of color could buy houses were zoned as commercial districts. So that meant that they were either close to or in areas where there were factories or small industry or whatever, which of course were less desirable. And then it became true that you couldn't get an FHA loan for a house in a commercial area because it was less desirable. So it was this kind of vicious cycle of where people could live, what they could get a loan for in terms of buying a house. And that happened systematically. So those are only just a few examples of the way this worked in laws at all levels. Housing is such an interesting thing in terms of asset development, the development of wealth, because it's one of the few assets that kind of directly relates to another human need, a direct human need. So like, you need a place to live. I mean, everyone needs a place to live. We have to answer that question. Where am I going to live? Am I going to rent, or am I going to own? And people who were able to buy houses often discovered, too, that that house became an asset. Now, a car, for example, is something else that we might really need, but a car is not an asset. You know, a car starts to lose value immediately. You get in the car and you drive it off the lot, and the value of it decreases dramatically. But with housing, there's this possibility of fulfilling this kind of basic need that we have, this basic desire to have our own place to live, and the development of an asset that might be for our benefit or the benefit of the people who come after us. That the wealth that's being transferred from generation to generation is often related to real estate. So that means that people who did not have the opportunity to invest in houses, especially at this crucial time, right after World War II, where it was actually easy and possible for a lot of people to buy houses they could afford to, even on a worker's salary. But the difference now between what it takes to buy a house in terms of the proportion of your income at that point was drastically different than it is today. Today, it's a completely different situation. But then it was possible for a lot of people to buy houses and to start to develop that asset. And then, as you may know from your own history, your own families, you know, you buy your first house and then you buy your next house, and perhaps if you're lucky enough to be able to do that, And that grows, it creates wealth. It creates wealth. So people who were deprived of that opportunity to buy homes, and in particular to buy homes in places that were desirable, were cut off from the possibility of creating that wealth. And that stacked up over generations. So our current situation, where we are now, the difference in wealth development between white people and people of color is drastically different. And a bunch of that is because of the opportunity, or the lack of opportunity, to be able to buy a house. So woven right together in this, this basic need, this basic desire for shelter, is right next to it this interesting process in our capitalist system of the appreciation of real estate and the development of wealth. And by wealth, really all that I mean is that you might have some money over here that is not directly part of your kind of day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year in and out. Do we have resources, extra resources? And housing has ended up being such an important piece in that whole picture. I don't know a whole lot about my generational backgrounds, kind of passed beyond my grandparents, but my father's father had a house. My mother's family had a farm. I don't know what happened to my grandfather Porter's house when he and my grandmother died. I presume that asset went on to become went to my father and his two brothers. I remember there was all kinds of complications when the farm was sold, because at that point it was a small family farm and it was wrapped up in all the stuff around family farms and whether that was even sustainable. So that was a different kind of thing. But my parents, kind of the joke with my parents was, we think oftentimes you live together and then you get married. My parents got married and then they didn't live together because my father was stationed in North Carolina during World War II. And so for 3 years, I think they were apart after they were married. But I think my mom was living in we have this great photo of this kind of Airstreamy kind of mobile trailer sort of thing. I think that's where they first lived, but it wasn't too long before they did buy a house. I think around the time that my brother was born. He's 3 years older than me. And then I remember one of my earliest memories is the house that we moved to next, which was the first house that I kind of grew up in. And when I was in 3rd grade, we sold that house and bought a house in the suburbs, which in Bloomington, Indiana, really means it was called Hoosier Acres. Go figure. But, obviously it was that kind of step up. And when just after I was married, my wife and I were part of a Mennonite community. And a bunch of us went together and bought a house in Indianapolis. I was living in Indianapolis at that point. We bought a house, 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom house for $25,000 on an assumable mortgage, which meant that we had to come up with $5,000 between the 5 or 6 of us. And again, I don't quite remember what happened to that asset. I didn't make any money off of that. But just that idea that in 1970, that would have been 75-ish, that you could buy a house for $25,000 of that size and get in so easily into housing, go figure. And there have been a couple of times in my own life, one of the things that my parents did with both my brother and I was when we were buying houses or investing somehow in real estate, they gave us support for that. So I think for both of us at times when we needed to come up with a down payment, we did part of it and they did part of it. So that generational wealth, you can see how that's happened in my life. And I'm sure that our generational stories are going to be quite different from person to person because of our age, and also whether we had access to that kind of thing. But there's no escaping the fact that to be able to buy a house, to be able to live where you want to live, has been severely restricted for a particular group of people. And that's not fair. That's not fair. And as progressive Christians, we're committed to justice for everyone, not just for ourselves or the people around us or for our children or our families, but we're committed to justice for everyone. And I don't have solutions. I'm not suggesting solutions, but I am suggesting that to know this about our history is so important. And it kind of picks apart a couple of the ways that people in the US sometimes think. One of those is that we're all pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps. That is such a myth. Because in one way or another, we're standing on the shoulders of the people who came before us. And sometimes we've been able to climb up on enough shoulders that to look down and see some of the people who didn't have shoulders to stand on, that the view is quite different. So to think that, oh, everyone is responsible for themselves and everyone has the same opportunity, that is just not true. Nor is it fair. So all I'm asking of you this morning is to know this. Hopefully you believe it, you've heard it. Hopefully you also believe it. If you're willing to take the next couple of steps to get even a little bit more information about this reality, there are ways to do that. I encourage you to do that. But for now, to know this and to understand that the repercussions of some of the things that have happened in housing, even over the last 3 or 4 generations, have had a huge effect on what's going on in our communities now. So when a young African-American man is shot and killed by the police, and people pour out into the streets to protest, and even perhaps violently, this is also happening because we've not integrated our communities. And because we've not integrated our communities in the ways that we might, our schools are not integrated, which means, again, people are suffering because the resources are not the same from school to school, primarily because of patterns around housing. So I call on every breath, every cell in you that cries out for justice, to just hear and receive this, and to know that that's true. I know that we can do that, and that in and of itself is a powerful act of justice. Amen.